Greetings, class. So, at the urging of my wife, I took a stop in urgent care, and it turns out I have pneumonia, which is why I was not getting any better. So, I am now on a medication, so I should be there to see you on Friday. So sorry for that. I never had pneumonia. It did not occur to me. Just knew I was not getting better, which seemed weird. So, okay. Sorry, I'm gonna have to take pauses. So I typed up a couple of short lectures. I wouldn't even call them lectures. They're like 1,500 words about various topics that we've yet to cover, but that were going to be part of kind of a crash course. Our class covered the whole chronology of Western political thought, going all the way back to ancient Greece. And so it's a long way that we had to cover. And so what happens is we wind up, halfway or 3/5 through the semester, and you hit the 19th century, and there's tons of different thinkers, the late 18th and then early 19th century. You get all these different thinkers. And so it doesn't give us a lot of time to get into the 20th century people. And so I do want to give you some of them. People like Berlin, people like Hayek, a little later, the Rawls and Nozick debates of the 1970s, which were very important. Probably not so much from a policy standpoint, but just in terms of what was going on in academia. But that is all for future lectures. Those are different short little videos I'm going to make for you here. And then Friday, of course, I'll do kind of a wrapping up, talking about sort of where Western political thought has wound up. Today, I'm going to kind of tie together the themes of the 19th century, carrying it on through the interwar period. And I had mentioned this in one of our lectures, and I spent a good deal of time talking about it in 20th century European history. The period 1914 to 1945 is really just a period of 30 years of just European civil war. And World War I destroys the world of the Enlightenment. And so the theorists that we do get, the political theorists that we do get, are people like Carl Schmitt, who we'll talk about, who essentially would say, look, constitutions are, just a cover, because, when a state of exception arises, the Constitution goes out the window. And we've seen this happen more than once. And so we will get to that. I'm going to, though, pick up basically where I left off last time with Nietzsche, where he was saying, look, the death of religious belief, this is the slow declining of religious belief, which has been slower in the United States than it was in Europe. But in Europe, during this time, in the 19th century, you have the rise of the hard sciences. You have the work of people like Darwin. You have man increasingly mastering his surroundings. You have German scholars who are looking at the Bible now as a piece of literature, not as scripture. And they're pointing things out like, well, this book, it actually is a combination of a bunch of different writings. You can tell because of these various philological traces here and there. And so it's very, it was a very destabilizing period for religious belief. And then, of course, the war happened, and that really destroyed that Whiggish notion that technological mastery, that reason and enlightenment values were going to lead us to higher and higher stages of human civilization and development. And Woodrow Wilson, when World War I broke out, was horrified because he viewed Europe as sort of, he viewed Europe as flawed, but he also viewed it as the center of world civilization, and here they were destroying themselves. So, Nietzsche had foreseen arising new religions in place of the old religions. And the things that he thought would take their place were things like socialism and nationalism, really. So, nationalism is the one that I'm going to pick up and talk about here, because it was the most successful and most powerful and most long-lasting of all of them. And as evidence for that, I would point out that it was able to break the class solidarity of the workers. Remember, for Marx, the working man has no country. World War I, in the eyes of the Socialist International, the Communist International, it was the German capitalists and the English capitalists and the French capitalists pitting their working classes against one another. And in the event of war, they were telling their followers, don't show up and fight. But when World War I happened, everyone was a little bit surprised, maybe, that they flocked to the colors. The workers flocked to the colors. And some of them did so for practical political reasons. Like, there were German socialists, which by that point, the Socialist Party was actually the largest party in the Reich at that point, in the Reichstag at that point. And they were volunteering en masse to show that they were loyal to the fatherland, that they could be trusted with the defense of the fatherland, because the reason that the nationalists always gave, and the so-called Iron and Rye coalition of the middle class and the industrialists and the military aristocracy gave for excluding them from actual decision making, was that they couldn't be trusted with defense of the nation. And so they were volunteering to show that they could be trusted. But anyway, so, and on the other hand, nationalism could be used to appropriate and expropriate the wealth of the capitalists. If you think about what happened during World War I, the state took their wealth. It's when, large-scale taxation took place. Many people are, outside of the historical fields aren't aware of the levels of taxation that were placed upon the wealthy in times of these total wars. But I mean, it could reach 90%. So, okay, so I'm going to say a little bit about nationalism, because nationalism is going to be one of the key drivers in the outbreak of World War I, which I am not going to get distracted in talking about. If you want to, you can take my class on it, or if you don't want to do that, you can just go find the lecture from one of the older classes. I believe that one's called Towards War. Yes. Sorry. Okay. I'm just gonna go for it. I wrote out a lecture here. I'm having trouble today. So, okay. Nationalism, at its most basic, is a belief that a people share a common identity, be it cultural, linguistic, historical, political. And interestingly, for the 19th century, that it should form the basis of a cohesive political entity, a state. This is critical because different groups of people who are clearly distinguishable from others is as old as recorded human history. What was different was this idea that true self-determination, that true legitimacy came from those people governing themselves based on these characteristics, forming their own political units. This was radically transformative, and it was going to completely destabilize the map of Europe, especially in the Balkans. So, nationalism is not a monolithic phenomenon. And so I'm going to go through a few of the different forms of nationalism. So, first, we have civic nationalism. This is Enlightenment nationalism, if you will. Civic nationalism is inclusive, rooted in the concept of citizenship and shared political values. Shared political values, that's the key there. Rather than anything like ethnicity or language or culture, although I guess language is part of the culture. Its adherents, civic nationalism's adherents, believe that anyone who committed themselves to the ideals, for example, of liberty and equality and fraternity could belong to the nation, specifically in this case, France. France, during the Revolution, for example, declared essentially that the French nation was open to all those who embraced the revolutionary ideals. And I had mentioned that they had, sorry, felt a sneeze coming on there, I thought, that they had taken the Jewish question and said, look, if they are willing to drop that identity and just embrace this French identity, this list of values, then they're French. And no matter what their ethno-linguistic background is, or their blood, or whatever the case may be, which was seen as quite radical. And actually, anti-Semitism would rear its head again in France in the 1890s during the Dreyfus Affair, which actually was a very big motivating factor. It was really the catalyzing factor for Theodor Herzl. He was a journalist in Paris at the time covering that, and the brutality of the anti-Semitism shocked him and made him realize that the Jewish people had to have a state because they were never going to be accepted if they couldn't be accepted in Republican enlightened France. So, topic for another time, but just interesting if you want to look into that. Ethnic nationalism. Sorry. I would not be putting you through this, except that we need to move through material over the next couple of days because the exam is next Thursday, so bear with me. In contrast, ethnic nationalism. So the first one was civic nationalism. I'm sorry, I'm talking so slow today. You might have forgotten. That last one was civic nationalism. Ethnic nationalism is exclusionary in the sense that it is rooted in some combination of shared blood, shared language, shared religion, shared culture. This form of nationalism was very influential in the late 19th century in Central and Eastern Europe, where communities sought to assert their identities in multi-ethnic empires like Austria-Hungary. And if you pull up a map of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I know you can find a map like this because I've looked one up before. If you look at the distribution of the various ethnic groups and then pull up a map of Central Europe after World War I when they broke up the empire, it literally matches up perfectly with, the creation of Slovenia and all those different places. So it's Woodrow Wilson was a big believer in the principle of self-determination by states who could show like ethno-linguistic homogeneity, although it was usually much more complicated than that. But it looked that way from across the pond, at least. Ethnic nationalism then could really prove problematic. Let's just leave it at that for now. Hybrids of these ideas. Romantic nationalism. It's closer to ethnic nationalism, really, than civic nationalism, but it emphasized the historical uniqueness of a nation. And this was, of course, a nod to the Romantic movement of the early 19th century. It celebrated the folklore. Folklore is really big. Folklore and myth. Because you see, the elites had a very cosmopolitan culture. Like, for example, if you were an elite, you learned to speak French because that was the language of diplomacy in France. There's a Tolstoy novel, I think it's War and Peace, where, yeah, I think it's War and Peace. It's been 20 years since I read it, but the prince and they don't even speak Russian. Like, they can't even talk to their subjects. They speak French. And so one of the nation-building projects of the 19th century was you had scholars going to the peasantry and collecting their myths and fables and folklore, and you had linguists going and collecting their words and things and like creating the national identity. So it's very self-conscious and deliberate. It's endlessly fascinating. So one of the big proponents of this, two of them, Herder in Germany and Mazzini in Italy. And of course, the 50s and 60s will be all about Italian and German unification. So, last one, imperial nationalism. Or I've seen it described as social imperialism. I think they both are fine labels. But basically what you're doing is you are using patriotic devotion to the national identity and fusing it with support of its imperial adventures abroad. And this intersects with social imperialism because it was a way to solidify the stratified society and to focus attention outward and to say, look, even if you are the poorest man in England, you have a part to play in ruling the greatest empire the world has ever seen. And there was great pride in that. Even many members of, for example, the Irish, the implacable haters of England, much focus is generally placed on movements like Sinn Féin or the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But it's worth pointing out that these were the minority, the overwhelming minority, the majority. Whether they were the Ulster Protestants, of course, supported England, but even the Unionists, the Catholic Unionists believed in using Parliament, in participating in Parliament, in using legislation. Sinn Féin, I read in a Hobson book, means ourselves alone in Gaelic, meaning like they eschewed all participation in the government, opting for violent revolution to free itself from English control. So that's just to say that they were a minority, that the project of empire was very powerful as a gel, that it could even keep the overwhelming majority of the Irish supportive of the English war in World War I. So I had mentioned some of the theorists. Yes. So in terms of the early German theorists of national identity, I'm not going to get really into a lot of these. What I will say, because I see that I'm already almost at 20 minutes and I said I was going to keep these short because I have several of them to do. I won't get too involved in the specific theorists. What I will say is that first, in the case of both Germany and Italy, one of the great stimulators of nationalism was the occupation of the land of Germany and Italy by a foreign power. Okay, so in the case of the Germans, it was it was their humiliation at the hands of the French. Napoleon effectively destroys the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which had existed for 1,000 years. And then they had occupied them and extracted, very humiliating concessions. That was a huge Kickstarter of German nationalism. It wasn't the only one, but it was very big. And it shares this in common with the Italians. The Italian peninsula, had long been divided. And it had long been a place where the various powers on the continent balanced and played against each other. It was like a chessboard. However, during the years of Napoleonic French dominance, France took sole control of Italy. And so it was no longer, and that might sound, well, what's the difference? Whether you have some Austrians here, some French here, some Spanish here, what's the difference? You have all the French here. The difference is, if there's multiple powers there, you as a local notable, this is all happening at the elite levels. We are not at like mass politics here. These were all elite projects. Nationalism was an elite project at this point. Mass nationalism will take root as the 19th century goes on, but we're still here in the, 1810s or 1820s. As a local notable, you could play the various powers against one another. Now, with just one foreign occupier dominating you all, there was one focal point of resistance. Now, the French were very strong, but after the French were defeated and put back in their little box, the Austrians were put in charge. And the Austrians were much weaker. Much, much weaker. And so, one thing I will say about Mazzini, because he was the Italian nationalist, he was a very famous one because he had articulated a doctrine of nationalism that's very at odds with the one that's going to ultimately be produced. His idea of nationalism was that by giving national self-representation, by giving a state to all the national peoples, that this would be a liberatory, democratizing process of the people against the crowned heads of Europe. Remember, we said that after the Congress of Vienna, you had the Holy Alliance and the promise among all the monarchs that we're just going to help each other suppress any discontents within our own societies here. We talked about the Mutiny of Cadiz, how the French king sent troops in to quash it, how when there was a Republican uprising in Rome, Louis Napoleon sent someone in to quash it, how when the Hungarians revolted, the Austrians called in the Russians to crush it. It was all the monarchs together against the people. And so Mazzini believed that nationalism was a unifying force, like socialism, a unifying force of the masses to lift them up against the rulers. But this isn't what happened, was it? Otto von Bismarck recognized that this power, and now we're talking about the 1860s, so we're fast forwarding quite a bit here, recognized, sorry, I gotta stop for just a second. Okay. All right. Bismarck, though he was not a German nationalist, I don't have time to get into what he was. He was a Prussian aristocrat. He did not believe in nationalism or anything like that. He liked his monarchy, thank you very much, but he recognized that the old Prussian aristocracy could not survive except in a new national, big German strong state. And so he created Germany and then channeled nationalism in a way that would allow the monarchy to continue to rule. So, this all ties back to the French Revolution. We talked about this. before the late 18th century, loyalty had been local, tied to your region, your religion, the local representatives in that region, and then ultimately up to the king. But it was not tied to this idea of a nation. The French Revolution changed this by mobilizing the entire population in the name of the nation, and then set about trying to standardize everything within the nation, standardizing all the laws, getting rid of all the privileges, standardizing the language, arming the population, right? Mass conscription. We talked about how revolutionary that was because no ruler would have armed all their people. That would have been crazy. And of course, Napoleon spreads this idea across Europe by conquering all of these countries. Armies mixed together. And after you got conquered, so for example, the Savoyards or the Bohemians or whatever the case may be, once you were defeated, you had to send troops to be in the French army. And so they're mingling with Frenchmen and French officers all the time. And they bring these ideas back. And so many times when there's an uprising, a liberal or a nationalist uprising, as in Spain in the early 1820s, as in Russia in the early 1820s, it's officers who had been involved in the Napoleonic campaigns and who had been exposed to these ideas. And so nationalism was viewed in the first half of the century as a real danger by rulers. It was a revolutionary force, just like Mazzini had hoped and theorized. Its peak was probably the year 1848. We talked about this, the springtime of the peoples, all of the nationalities rising up across Europe and demanding a whole variety of things. There was an intersection of a lot of things going on there at that exact moment. But besides lower prices for bread, you had a combination of demands for things like workers' protection, more liberalism, national self-determination, constitutional freedoms. But as the 19th century progressed, nationalism underwent a significant transformation. From being a revolutionary ideology that challenged empires and monarchies, it became a tool for those very establishments. And this shift, of course, can be seen most clearly in that unification of Italy. Because while early Italian nationalists like Mazzini envisioned a republic, the actual unification of Italy was driven and accomplished by the most conservative kingdom on the peninsula. It's not technically on the peninsula. Piedmont, Sardinia, under Count Camillo Cavour. Nationalism became a means of binding people to the state. Governments promoted patriotic education, national holidays, and symbols like flags and anthems to foster a sense of national unity. Writers like Ernst Renan, who wrote a lot about nationalism in the late 19th century, emphasized the importance of shared memory and collective will in defining the nation. So things like national holidays, these didn't really exist. Like, you might have some local holidays and stuff, but like now it's specific national holidays. England creates something called Empire Day. And again, these the spreading of public schools, it was to inculcate not only like reading and writing so that you could participate in the industrial economy, but it was also to inculcate the proper view of the state, because that's where you would get your education about your state and where it was in the world and where it came from. So, yes. So nationalism really becomes intertwined with militarism, because increasing the greatness of your state, of your national state, in a period of very intense state competition, which the late 19th century was. There was a huge race for the final few colonies that were left to be had. It was very dangerous too, because you had this temptation, because these were not full democracies, and you had highly autocratic maybe I shouldn't use that word because it's so loaded now. For example, in the newly united Germany, even though there was theoretically full suffrage for all men, the government was itself appointed by the Kaiser, by the king. And he and his ministers and his allies really leaned on nationalist propaganda, the need to make Germany great, to achieve great things for Germany, the fear that other countries were trying to keep Germany down, in order to really distract from the socialists who were gaining ground in the cities, who wanted, the Reichstag to appoint the government, just how it was in England, for example. Not that England was perfect, but England was obviously much more democratic than Germany was. They were both empires, but one was much more democratic domestically. As I said, if you're interested more in nationalism, you can go watch that lecture I mentioned at the top. I had to say something about nationalism. There's no one theorist of nationalism, but as a class on Western political thought, there's nothing more important, I think, once you move beyond the French Revolution and the theorists of things like Marxism and utilitarianism and things like that, then making sure you have an understanding of nationalism. And so there you have it. It began as a revolutionary ideology born of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution that sought to liberate and unite the people. Over time, it evolved into a powerful tool for state building, imperial competition, and the consolidation of power. And nationalism remains a double-edged sword. It can inspire unity, meaning, a sense of belonging, but it can also breed exclusion, conflict, and domination. And there's a very good book on this subject. I'll just wrap it up by saying this. Very good book on the subject. It was written about 25 years ago. A fellow by the name of Jack Snyder, who was at Columbia at the time, called From Voting to Violence: Democratization and Nationalist Conflict, where he essentially takes several case studies, including Yugoslavia, which had just broken up in the 1990s, where he showed that it is elites who, when their position is threatened, have consistently used nationalism as a way to justify their continued hold on power and privilege, and that this is what happened in Yugoslavia, and that it's what's happened in a bunch of different cases. So there you go. That is nationalism. Nationalism. And here's what so we're right up to 1914. There's been increasing competition between the states for power, for position, and a crisis is going to emerge in the Balkans. The reason the assassination winds up becoming a big deal is because the Serbian government had been helping, essentially, ethnic separatists inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire to destabilize the empire. Because Austria-Hungary, uniquely among those states, could not make an appeal to nationalism. It was too polyglot. And so it viewed these repeated provocations by Serbia as a danger to its very existence, that they were trying to provoke a Slavic uprising within their empire, which would destroy it. Russia could not back down from its support because of the role that it had cultivated for itself, its regime, in Moscow as a defender of the Slavic peoples. And then again in Berlin, in Germany, the socialists were gaining ever more and more political power, and the military and political leadership believed that taking advantage of this opportunity could be a way to solve their domestic political problem with victory abroad, There were other concerns, but that was definitely one of them. German public opinion was turning decisively sour. They had faced huge backlash for backing down to the French and British over Morocco in, I think it was 1906 and 11. Having a tough brain day. I can't think of the Agadir, and I can't remember the other one. Sorry. But so sorry. And then nationalism and will of course feature very prominently in the war itself, and then in how the post-war map is drawn up. You have all these new, small, vulnerable states created at the behest of Woodrow Wilson, who says, no, 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 we fought this war to make it safe for the world, safe for democracy, by which he meant Europe. And so these people are going to get their own states. Well, now they're too weak singly to stand up to now the Soviets and then the Nazis. And of course, Hitler is motivated by a very aggressive nationalist German ideology as well. And so nationalism is going to be huge here. And there's a reason that efforts by European elites, West European elites, in the post-war years were so much aimed at tempering and submerging nationalism as much as possible in inter-European arrangements. Whether, today we have the EU, but there were efforts right away, from the time the war ended, right away, to try to fuse these states together into collective bodies and to create a European identity. A process that is still ongoing, and remains to be seen how that will turn out. But there you have it. Nationalism. So when we pick up next, we're going to pick up in the 1940s and 1950s. I'll say one or two things about a couple of theorists in the 1920s and 30s. Okay, thanks all.